Welcome to Insights with me, Dan O'Brien, and our esteemed guest today, Sir Ivan Rogers. This is the first time we've had an in-person audience in the 4 years of this season of this series, and it's great that Sir Ivan is the person to do it, as he has been a very insightful contributor to the Institute on all matters related to the departure of Britain, the ongoing process of Britain leaving the EU. So it's fantastic to have him back in person and to have people here as well as our usual online audience. So with that, let's get going. Maybe we'll start with Ivan, where Britain is. Is there a centre of gravity in terms of public opinion in Britain regarding its role in the world, its relations with its neighbours, its engagement with the rest of the world? Where is that, if there is such a thing, and how has it changed since the Brexit vote?
Well, first of all, Dan, thanks very much again for inviting me. Really great to be here in person, having not been here for 4 years. So it's splendid to be here. Centre of gravity, I think, is there a single one? That would be overstating it. I think we're still struggling with what the post-Brexit economic model is. Public, as you can see, pretty grumpy. Not alone there. Many publics, all publics across the Western world, pretty grumpy for obvious economic reasons and been through a whole multitude of shocks. Conception of where Britain belongs, I think it would be difficult to argue that there is a very clear single centre of gravity. Has the general sentiment shifted against Brexit as a kind of success and a liberation? Yes, clearly the polling is much worse now for the Brexit side of the debate. And people say, I always distrust these polls a bit, because what do they really mean? And they're people not really being asked to act on anything. And there is anyway no prospect of an accession negotiation. So it's all a bit artificial. But you're now running at about 60% sort of saying Brexit was a mistake. So there's a lot of regrets set in, but as I say, I don't think one should overinterpret that. One, there's no European appetite to think about the British question. Two, there's no appetite on any side of British politics to think about accession. So we're not in that world. But if you ask people, people regret that they did it or regret that we voted for it. But that's part of the overall kind of disaffection with probably the entire political elite and certainly the current Conservative government, which is really phenomenally unpopular. I think Rishi Sunak is actually polling at a personal level slightly below where Liz Truss got to at the point where she blew herself up. So we really have a very unpopular Conservative government at the moment. Whether that lasts through the remainder of this year, whether the polls narrow, as I would expect them to, as we head towards a general election, whether some of the kind of reform voters who are the ex-UKIP and Brexiteer voters come back to the Tory party because they don't want a Labour landslide, all those things, come in the next few months. Before
we get on to the next British government, you have made a point that Britain has had these periods of sort of spasm in terms of its relations with the continent over the centuries.
Over centuries,
and
yeah.
So this is not, this is not, as sort of some people might think, a unique phenomenon. It's part of a sort of pattern as.
Yes, and I mean, I'm very wary of kind of national stereotypes of any sort, including of ourselves. But I mean, I do think it's a centuries-long sort of tradition. I do think the spasms over trade policy, in the broadest sense of trade policy and strategy, have happened. I mean, you go back to the middle of the 19th century, and after all, the Irish implications of the repeal of the Corn Laws in the mid-1840s kept the then Tory party, obviously a totally different party in a non-democracy, out for 20 years. Then you had, beginning of the 20th century, Joseph Chamberlain, imperial preference against free trade. The Tories go in a more protectionist direction. That carries on, incidentally, right through to Neville Chamberlain, his son, in the 1930s, at a time when the whole world is going more protectionist. And you had Smoot-Hawley in the States, but you had the kind of Stanley Baldwin, Neville Chamberlain. The Conservative Party at that stage was not a liberal party, and it was an imperial preference party. So this has happened before. This is obviously different because it's, deliberately leaving a trading bloc, which is not just a trading bloc, as the UK has discovered over the last 7 years, 7 or 8 years, better than when it was in that bloc. is a dramatic thing to do. And it's not surprising that has economic and social consequences. It's not surprising that it leaves people on both sides of the debate in the UK casting around for, so how do we make Brexit work? What does making Brexit work mean? We didn't leave the EU, presumably, in order exactly to replicate everything we had when in it, but without a voice and without a vote. But how do you make Brexit work? What does that consist in? It's not surprising that 8 years on, I mean, I was obviously famously gloomy in 2016, and I didn't want to be gloomy, but I just thought it would take a long time to get to the other side and get to a stable post-Brexit world, because it's a very complex set of decisions. And I think people were cavalier, sometimes charlatan, about what the options were. They wanted a genuine sort of have your cake and eat it. We'll have all the free trading relations that we like with our European erstwhile partners, but we'll be free and sovereign, and we'll be buccaneering in the mid-Atlantic. And of course, all of that, it doesn't look quite the same in 2024 as it did in 2016.
And the question is how it's going to look in after 4 years of a Labour government, which everyone sort of assumes, given the polling now, that Labour will get into government. In terms of where the Labour Party is on the EU, how significantly will things change, particularly after a couple of years when presumably they've bedded in, they don't feel the need to cleave so closely to the Conservatives, where they can do things that are different. So sort of specifically, are there areas where the UK could decide to align with EU legislation, say somewhere in the chemicals industry, say, where the industry in the UK wants that? It's in the UK's interests. Will it be politically feasible for the UK to say, we are going to be a rule taker because that's what our industry wants, or will that still be too politically toxic?
Well, it's a great question, extremely difficult to answer. And you've seen that Labour has ruled out rejoining the single market. That's essentially for two reasons. One, they can't and won't do free movement of people. Two, they can't do and won't do complete rule taking. And I've always argued, I argued before the referendum and argued after the referendum with then Conservative ministers, there's no Norwegian-style option for the UK that could ever work. Norway can do it because it's a very, a small, quite under-diversified, extremely rich, commodity-rich economy, but actually it can take a lot of rules on lots of stuff which are not central to its economy. You couldn't do that in the UK, and there's no democratic legitimacy to it. So a Norwegian-style model, very close in, and a lot of rule-taking was never on for the UK. So I always thought when we left, and used to say, I think we'll go much further out than people imagine. And I said quite a lot of that in Brussels well before the referendum. I think that's proven right, although we had the kind of byways of the Theresa May and Ollie Robbins negotiation in 2017-18, where May wanted a sort of bespoke halfway house deal with sort of quasi-customs union relationship, and she wanted that partly for Northern Irish reasons. Where will Labour go? Depends partly on the scale of the majority and the composition of that majority. So if they get a thumping majority in a landslide, more things become viable. But it also depends on the composition of the majority. So if they get a huge number of red wall seats and they sweep the red wall, and all the people who allied with Johnson and voted for Johnson, and some of them still want to vote for reform, essentially come back home to the Labour Party, that will not be a very kind of pro-free movement and pro-further integration sort of phalanx of MPs, because they'll be looking at how do they hold on in 2028, 29. If they win a lot of Scottish seats, though, and they may sweep aside the SNP heavily, those people probably want a closer relationship with the EU, which is on the whole more popular. So it's very complex. I think it's not just the scale of the majority, it's the composition of it. You then reach beyond the single market. You can't do the single market, and that led to the famous Barnier staircase graph of you can have one of those or one of those or one of those. It was slightly specious in my view, although I'd produced my own version of the staircase graph before he did. There's something in it. You can be Norway, you can be Canada, whatever, but you can't be anything in between. You can't be bespoke. We've ended up with something which is possibly even more distant than Canada, and that was a deliberate decision by Johnson with the support of the Liz Trusses and David Frost, and David Frost as a negotiator. That was a deliberate act on the part of a government that wanted the thinnest possible Brexit deal. Want to get as far out of this club as possible. The whole purpose of Brexit is to diverge I'm not going to allow the Irish question, the tail to wag the dog. I want fundamentally a liberatory Brexit, which takes us a long way out. The whole purpose of this is to recapture control over our economy and our social order, and we're going to do things radically differently because that's the point of it. Well, as you can see, we've now tracked back a bit after the Liz Truss experiment blew up. Rishi Sunak is a genuine and even, I think, pretty fervent Brexiteer at the time of the referendum, but he's been much more cautious about deliberate acts of divergence than many in his party want. And he's calmed all this debate down. And not only did he produce the Windsor framework, he's disappointed his own party by being, in their view, not radical enough on taking advantage, of all the opportunities that they believe Brexit gives you. Labour has said very little because it doesn't really want Europe to figure in the general election, to be honest. I mean, this is not upside for Labour as they see it. They don't want this issue and free movement and all the kind of conservative accusations that they'll go about reversing Brexit. They don't want that to dominate the general election campaign. You can understand that. They've therefore been so far rather reluctant to say what they've mentioned mobility agreements, they've mentioned a veterinary agreement, they've mentioned various things about security and defence, which we can no doubt come on to. But they've been pretty vague. The problem with your point on things like chemicals, is that on their minds, and will there be a big lobby in various bits of industry to say, actually, disalignment and divergence is not a good for us, it's a cost for us, and it's very damaging to our interests, so please reverse this, and can we get closer to the EU and stop this nonsense? And there's a lot of that coming from a lot of big businesses in particular. The difficulty with that is obvious, which is the risk is Labour ends up in its own version of a kind of cherry-picking world. And it sort of says, well, where it suits us to have ongoing deep convergence and dynamic alignment, and to replicate the EU rulebook in order to maximise market access into the EU market, which really matters to certain types of industries, we'll do that. But where it doesn't suit us, on things where we think we can regulate ourselves better on financial services or AI or data, we'll carry on diverging. Well, good luck with that. I mean, I can imagine what plenty of Brussels responses, let alone Parisian responses, will be on that, which is, this is just the latest glorious version of British cherry picking and it's not on offer. So I think the honest answer to you is, look, I think they're doing a lot of thinking on this. I think they should be. It then relates to what Rachel Reeves is, she'll be the Chancellor, what her conception is of where is growth going to come from in the UK economy, because they all face the Liz Truss question, if I can put it like that, which is we've got anemic growth. It's not incidentally sometimes as disastrous as it's made out to be outside the UK. We're bumbling along, pretty much flatlining. So is Germany, so is France, so is most of the Eurozone. But you can't look at the UK economic performance and think we have a strong productivity record, because we don't. We have a very weak productivity record. And we've got endemic problems, and our trend rate of growth is 1 to 1.5%, say. That's very difficult then to finance the public services that Labour wants to finance. Labour wants to come in and tell its own people, we're going to do vastly better on the health service and on education and law and order and many things. It's also going to face major defence spending pressures. Well, you can't finance that unless you can raise the trend rate of growth. So the primary question for Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves is, how do you raise the trend rate of growth? And is there then a European and international dimension behind a growth strategy? Or are you saying, well, let's focus on the things that we can do entirely domestically, which don't involve an international negotiation?
Well, so on the things you can do domestically, I suppose many of our members here constantly, anytime we're discussing this, do fear that Britain could use its position outside the EU to undercut regulatory. So there is definitely a view in some sectors of industry, some industries here, that Britain does have opportunities. Yeah. And as you mentioned, there is criticism of Rishi Sunak that he hasn't taken more advantage. Do you think in the future that there will be, that there, where, let me rephrase the question, where are the opportunities for the UK that could really undercut and that we might need to be worried about in terms of Britain stealing a march?
Well, I think they're primarily in those new areas where there would be reservations probably across the UK political spectrum about the wisdom of the way in which the EU regulates. You can be a fan of the EU or not a fan of the EU, but it doesn't always regulate in the most brilliant fashion, and the role of the European Parliament and the way in which compromises are made sometimes produces a level of regulation and a type of regulation and depth of regulation that business finds pretty alienating. Let's be honest, you have plenty of that debate inside the Eurozone. So is there sometimes a sense on both sides of the divide, well, we could do all this better, we could do it faster, we could be lighter touch on regulation, we've got the common law approach to life and not the Napoleonic Code approach to life. I'm not saying that's as prevalent in the Labour Party as it is in the Conservative Party, but there'll be elements of that on financial services and biotech and AI and whatever. We can do it differently, we can be more flexible, we can be more nimble, we don't have to be fully aligned. So I think that there will still be a flavour of that inside a Labour government and some issues around that inside a Labour government, even if it isn't as prevalent as in the Tory government. Why has Sunak not gone further, though, given that he was a fervent Brexiteer? Because in the end, you carry a cost through sheer uncertainty and unpredictability. And what business has no doubt been saying to him, certainly businesses constantly say it to me, is we're fed up with the chaos. And we're fed up with the lack of clarity about what is the UK's regulatory order. And then when, of course, the hard men of the right, above all in the European Research Group, wanted to sunset all residual EU regulations, sweep away all this ghastly stuff off the UK statute book and do stuff ourselves. What's the downside of that? If you have a sort of sunsetting provision and they try to impose that both on Truss and Sunak, well, you've got a deadline by which all this stuff is going to be removed from the statute book. You don't know what's going to be on the statute book. And then I'm afraid businesses, multinational businesses, and I've heard from legions of investors over the years in multiple continents saying, well, we don't understand what the UK regulatory order is. Could we just have a bit of predictability and certainty? We're not going to invest in this country when we don't know what your regulatory system is. And I think that has then sort of percolated through into, Hunt and Sunak thinking, a period of calm after the chaos of autumn 2022 would be welcome. And we have to, tamp some of this stuff down because we need to reassure investors that we haven't gone mad. And that's then militated in the direction of sort of more conservatism in the old-fashioned term of the conservatism of kind of let's not rush too much of this or deliberately throw everything up in the air and leave people totally uncertain about our regulatory order. So Labour will face some of that. I mean, they're magnifying. Rachel Reeves, it's always very difficult for a Labour shadow chancellor to demonstrate, your money's going to be safe with us. And why does Labour lose most elections? It loses them on economic competence and, fear of what you'll do on taxation and spending and regulation. In my adult lifetime, there have been 11 elections. The Conservatives have won 8 of them. Tony Blair won the other 3. There hasn't been a Labour leader born within the last 100 years other than Tony Blair who's ever won an election. So an awful lot of Labour's job at a time like this is to reassure the public and Middle England public, which is quite a conservative public, of don't worry, it'll be all right with us, and we'll be prudent and we'll be stable and we'll be predictable and we're pro-big. I mean, Rachel Reeves has been out overnight saying we will be more pro-big business and more pro-business than Tony Blair's government. So just constantly magnifying that message. That therefore goes into predictability, certainty, clarity. You're going to know where you stand. We want to pull private sector investment into the UK, make it one of the best places in the world to sort of invest in. That argues for more predictability and certainty of your regulatory order. But you can then see what the right-wing attack is. If there is a Labour government, the right-wing attack will be, well, we didn't leave the EU in order to replicate exactly what we used to have in the EU. So you're not making Brexit work. You're deliberately not doing Brexit. That's going to be the argument, I think.
So does that sort of, because I'm sort of sitting back and in 2016, I think the case for Brexit was stronger than it is today. Where you had a functioning WTO, you had a free trading world, you didn't have the geopolitical tensions that you had. Yeah. Now, somebody in Canada recently called it blockalization.
Yeah.
I haven't heard this
regionalization.
Exactly. Because the world is going. So it makes it more difficult for a country to do those different things. So with what you've just said and those trends, does that mean that Labour is actually going to be a very small c conservative government, very cautious government for the first few years. Because you did mention that Rachel Reeves has a fascination with Bidenomics, and
Yes.
Labour will instinctively want to do more if the money is there.
Yeah.
But do you see those sort of ambitious policies being constrained by lack of money, caution, and therefore we in Ireland could sort of sit back and say, okay, you're going to have a very cautious new government in the UK that's not going to do much radical stuff that could affect us?
Well, they're going to have to do some radical stuff, because you're right, the fundamental question is the money isn't there. So if you look at the spending settlement and the viability of the existing spending settlement and the viability of existing tax rates, it's going to be a very difficult parliament, the next parliament, and there's not going to be loads of public money. So why can't we do Bidenomics in the way the Americans do Inflation Reduction Act? Because we can't afford it. And we will rattle the markets if we try and afford it. Nor will we go a more Germanic route of throwing vast state aids at the problem. So, I talked to an EU insider who told me that 45% of all state aids paid out since the pandemic were paid out in a single member state. Well, why is that? That's Germany. Why is that? Because they've got the fiscal space to do it. We don't have the fiscal space to do it. That, of course, then means that Rachel Reeves says, there's going to be pots and pots of public money for every priority that my backbenchers have across the board. And we need to get private sector investment in at scale on the green transition and presumably defence industrial capability. We can come to that question. So again, that argues in favour of stability, clarity, certainty. You can trust us. You now have a period of calm and stability where you can understand where the UK is going. So I think there'll be a lot of that. But that's quite radical in a way, because we've had a fundamental problem of external investors wondering where the hell we are and whether there is a predictable, certain environment. So there'll be a lot of broadcasting to that effect, but broadcasting is ultimately not enough. You have to pull in very large sums of public money or private money on the green transition. And I think there'll be a lot of emphasis on that.
And brings me perfectly to the next question on the whole security piece. Energy security is something, food security are issues that you've raised. Energy security, we're very much tied in to the UK in terms of energy security. How do you see that agenda evolving as under a new government? Do you have concerns around that? We came through the sort of gas shortage fears after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Is that an issue that is going to come back on the agenda, or do you feel that having come through that crisis, that at least in the short to medium term, energy security is not something we need to worry too much about?
Well, I still worry about it. I think the EU has done pretty well on energy security, although, of course, what has happened is it's had to escalate it to European Council level and leaders level, and an awful lot of kind of energy policy has been, made more supranational in content and in style. We would have been very uncomfortable with that, incidentally, just as we would have been very uncomfortable with what we'd have vetoed, Next Generation EU. So had we remained in the Union, we would have hated the health measures on the pandemic. We'd have hated the kind of energy security and pan-European dimension and the extent to which that was going to lead. Lots of things that have happened, not just because we left, but because of real world crises that had we still been there, we would have opposed, because we hated the budgetary implications and the policy implications and the drift to the supranational level. So I don't think the energy security thing is a short term. Mercifully, we all got through last winter and the winter before pretty well. And I think the EU has been pretty energetic, pardon the pun, on its policies. But there's a hell of a long way to go. On EU-UK cooperation, of course, the current government is keener on sort of bilateral cooperation, occasionally plurilateral cooperation, more soft cooperation on North Sea or on wind, on interconnectors, whatever. It doesn't like pan-EU potential legal frameworks. But is there a big question there for Labour about whether you do more with the EU, whether that's more systematic? There's a genuine legal framework. There's a legal negotiation on aspects of economic security. Because you raise the right point. I mean, 2016, whether you like Brexit or not, you could argue, I think it was already a bit naive in 2016, given we'd already had Crimea at that point. And, the writing was on the wall as to kind of where the Russians might be headed. And we could see developments in China as well in terms of, their approach to economic governance and multilateralism. But you could argue in 2016, there is a world trade framework. We're multilateralists. We don't want to be imprisoned in a regional bloc. We want free trade deals with everybody on the planet, the kind of David Davis stuff to me, but he said it publicly as well. We're going to have a free trade deal with everybody on the planet, basically, and we're going to do it rapidly, and we're going to sit in the mid-Atlantic. We're going to be a hub in the mid-Atlantic, and everybody's going to want to deal with us. So there was an awful lot of that doctrine coming primarily from the right of the Conservative Party, but from quite liberal people saying, that's where we belong. We don't belong in this bloc. We belong outside it. And we're going to be networked with everybody from China to India to the US, and we're going to have free trade deals. That's what I call sort of values-free globalization. Well, we're not in that world. We're in a world where everybody's now talking about resilience and security and nearshoring and friendshoring. And you're getting that, incidentally, from sometimes the remarkably inconsistent Liz Truss. So, you know, in one breath, one gets the kind of, I'm still a fervent multilateralist free trader. In another, it's coalitions of the free world against the authoritarian world, which after all points to economic security, nearshoring, friendshoring. We reduce and then remove our dependency on evil authoritarian states. Well, that's quite difficult to reconcile with where we are, because we're then going to need the Europeans as well as the Americans, and we're going to need major economic security, energy security deals with the Europeans, because who the hell else are we really reliant on who is not potentially unreliable in terms of authoritarian governments? Who are our friends? You know, they're within the G7 and then some outside the G7 who are allied with us. And this is the big uncertainty for me, and both on the Conservative side and on the Labour side of politics, is where does that take us? Because if you're into a British version of Bidenomics, you don't have the public money, you've got to have the private money, but you also have to have a much warmer and closer relationship with the people on whom you think you can rely when push comes to shove, and who are not going to be hostile actors in deliberately creating dependency in your economy.
Definitely going to come on to defense industry in Europe and hard security issues, but maybe just a diversion, because I remember the last time you were here, or maybe 2 times ago, you made the point which you've made now, that the EU's pandemic bond issuance wouldn't have happened. Well, British would have vetoed it.
Yeah.
You mentioned it again
under
today.
Any government of whichever party I ever worked for, and I did a lot on EU finances over 30 years, yeah, I think we would have vetoed it.
And I hope this isn't a diversion, but do you think that the other 27 would have gone ahead with it, like the fiscal treaty?
Yeah, they'd have found a way around the Brits.
And okay,
and that was the origin. As you know, I've written this publicly. That was the origin of the crisis. Actually, the origin of the crisis was probably when we joined. But I mean, the origin of the 2016 crisis is the Fiscal Compact Treaty crisis. I came into the Sherpa job in the UK the day after that had happened. It was an incredibly difficult European Council. And what happened? Cameron sought to prevent the Eurozone going ahead with stuff unless, on the Fiscal Compact Treaty, unless he got a sort of counterparty set of gains on things that really mattered to him. And basically, the French and Germans concluded at the EPP meeting a couple of days before that European Council in 2011, okay, we'll go round him then and we'll do an intergovernmental treaty which will prevent him vetoing. So he goes back, claims there's been a veto, gets a poll boost from making that claim. They think we've got round him and we've done a treaty at then 17 Eurozone only to get round a British blockage. That's the beginning of the end. It's the consequence of that decision that forces Cameron, Osborne, Hague to reflect on, okay, so if they have found a technique of essentially getting around potential British blockage to deliver the kinds of treaty changes they want via an intergovernmental route which goes outside the treaties, I need to do something bigger and bolder. That leads directly to the Bloomberg speech, which argues for an in-out referendum. So it all begins there, really. I mean, as I say, you can trace it back a lot further than that. But that's what would have happened. I mean, the budgetary wizards in Brussels and elsewhere would have said, well, this is intolerable. This is what we want to do. This is what the Eurozone needs to do. These people are not in the Eurozone. We'll have to find a way around them.
Okay, interesting.
Well, there'd have been another crisis then. Had we remained in, this is what I find somewhat frustrating about some of the kind of Remainer type arguments still in British politics, because it's a bit naive about where we would have been had we remained in. There's lots of stuff that the EU has got on and done, which may well be very sensible in policy terms, but which we would have opposed under any government I would have worked.
Back to the future. Defence. things have changed radically in Europe since 2022. I think you've used the term, the scales have fallen from people's eyes. Britain is, of course, an integral part of NATO, that other great institution of the Euro-Atlantic world, or Europe as well. In terms of cooperation with the rest of Europe, could you talk a bit about where that could go, and particularly issues around ramping up defense capacity, just the industrial side of it, and how that works in the single market and with the EU? And is there a problem there for Europe to advance its security interests, beef up its capacity, while at the same time, is there an issue with Britain being out of the single market in that regard?
Yeah, I think this is going to be the big issue actually of the next 12 to 18 months. Certainly if there's a Labour government, because I think they will want some security pact to be defined, how wide that goes, what it consists in, whether they're economic and energy and other food and other components beyond pure hard defence. But we all know, sadly, the miserable history of the last couple of years. When I talked about scales falling from people's eyes, we went through Crimea, we had some sanctions packages. I was obviously heavily involved as ambassador in working up those packages. A lot of work went into it, but they weren't very effective and serious and hard sanctions packages from either the EU and the US. And you have to conclude that Putin concluded from that, well, I can largely get away with this, and it doesn't have any massively detrimental effect on my economy. And he learned that lesson, and we then track forward to 2022, and we are where we are. Now, the EU's response obviously has been, again, to go down a sanctions route. Look, we could have an endless debate about how effective sanctions ever are against anybody. I don't think sanctions alone will, win a war for the Ukrainians, or because Russia is prepared to fight a remorseless war in which it loses hundreds of thousands of its own troops, and it thinks that's a price worth paying for the territorial gains and the overall geostrategic gains it thinks it makes out of it. So far, sanctions, on which I think the EU and UK have worked well together, haven't deterred Russian aggression, and obviously developments in the battlefield over the last few months have not been wildly encouraging. So I think then scales have fallen from people's eyes across Europe and in the UK of, okay, so there's an expensive form of conventional warfare that we need to be able to wage, and we don't collectively have the defence industrial capability at our disposal to do all this, and we're tremendously reliant on the American security umbrella. And, we all know the story of all our defence spending and our defence industrial capability, and have we let it wither too far? So when Rishi Sunak says, I want to up the ambition to 2.5% defence spending, which actually replicates what Boris Johnson, I think, said about a couple of years ago, Labour is going in the same direction, although saying only when economic circumstances and the fiscal rules allow. But we're all seeing defence spending tick up. My own view is defence spending will go a lot higher than 2.5%, and probably will need to go a lot higher than 2.5% by the end of the decade. I don't wish to be excessively gloomy, but I think we're in a rearmament phase. And we may sadly be in an interwar phase or a pre-war phase. And, we can then come on to the kind of US-China questions which lie behind that. So I think all of that, a lot of common ground between the Brits and lots of Europeans, lots of good constructive discussions about what do we need, how rapidly can we get there, what do the Ukrainians need, what's the capability we collectively need to turn the tide on the ground. The difficulty, as you say, Dan, is it runs straight into single market when you get into defence industrial capability. And that worries me, because you will have seen, or many of you will have seen, Ursula von der Leyen talking about the need for a defence commissioner, defence vice president of the European Commission. As you said, the Commission's really had no role in defence over the last several decades. The Commission is looking, with the best will in the world, it's looking for a way into this to become a serious player at the geostrategic level, and that's defence industry capability, because that takes you into procurement, and it takes you into a kind of, are we collectively punching our weight? I think Mario Draghi will say something about this in his report in the summer, very focused on the fact, I've heard Mario Draghi say it, we spend more on defence, all 27 combined, than the Chinese. What do we get for it? plethora of programs, plethora of individual things which are not reconcilable with each other. We're punching beneath our weight because although we spend all the money, we don't get the bang for the buck. So this debate about how do we get the bang for the buck, what does that mean then in terms of our internal organisation? What do we do on procurement rules? That's coming in the EU. The Commission sees an opportunity. As I say, I don't wish to sound unkind about the Commission, but the Commission is therefore looking for its angle of how do we in Brussels become a major player in this debate? It's not just NATO. That's defence industry procurement. Well, you don't need me to tell you that that is immediately going to raise the question of, okay, are we building security and resilience and capability as EU 27 only? And there'll be a strand of thinking, some of it coming from the private sector as well as the public sector. That's EU firms only or single market firms only. Therefore, the British are not in it. British chose to leave the single market. They're not talking about coming back into the single market. What's it got to do with them? Now, personally, I find that, it's the strategic autonomy argument, which you hear a lot about. It's an old French argument, but it's morphed into different form. And you've now got quite a bit of support for strategic autonomy in Baltic states, Sweden, Finland, because they know the Russians, they live next to the Russians. They're very worried about European preparedness. They're worried about their own preparedness. And suddenly all those shibboleths, which were rather non-Parisian, if I can put it like that, in the north of Europe about strategic autonomy are they're dwindling a bit. I mean, I've heard Finns and Baltic states people talk about the need for more European strategic autonomy on defence. And then I always say to them, okay, so are the Brits in strategic autonomy or outside it by definition because it's single market only? So I think that debate is coming. There are some in Central and Eastern Europe who say, no, we need the Brits in the equation and we need British and American armaments. There will be others across the European Union who will say, no, 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 we can't be reliant on third countries who might potentially be unreliable, not only in the case of the Americans, but a putative future conservative government in the UK might not be reliable. So I think there's a huge debate coming, and it's coming very soon, on what do we mean by this, and are the Brits part of that discussion and engaged in that discussion really intimately with what's our overall capability to ensure that we can protect our eastern borders from Baltics to Balkans? Are the UK part of that equation and integral to that debate, or are they à côté?
And the context of that moving on, clearly will be what happens in Ukraine.
Yeah.
If Russia is perceived to have won, if there's a cessation, and particularly if that happens in the context of the United States, a new administration of the United States basically going over democratic Europe's head and the Ukrainians' heads and cutting a deal with Moscow. How, in both scenarios, one, the Russians win and the Ukrainians cede lots of territory, and in the second scenario where it's imposed effectively by the US, how much do you think that will change the scenario in terms of moving ahead, having these debates about rearming, about taking a more radical position in defending the eastern border?
I think it would change a lot within Europe, because I mean, every debate I ever take part in or here is now about Trump and the implications of Trump and what does this mean for the existence and survival of the American security umbrella, both nuclear and conventional. The most benign interpretation is that ultimately Trump beats up the Europeans and says you simply all got to spend vastly more on defence. And I told you that before, and it's time you got serious and you're in charge of your conventional defence. But obviously the nuclear umbrella remains. The less benign, and we'll see, as I say, where Mario Draghi goes and what happens in the European Commission strategic agenda. But the less benign is obviously worrying people that the Americans cease to be a reliable strategic security partner, and Europe's on its own. That then raises the British question for me, and I want to emphasise, very openly, publicly. I mean, people are not thinking about the British question anywhere in the European Union. I wish they were, but they're not, because they're born rigid with the last several years and the distrust and the bad faith and the perceptions that the UK government couldn't be trusted and negotiated with. I think we're through the worst of that sentiment, but I would be lying to you if I said I thought there was a lot of work going on in capitals about what might happen and what might be done with a different British government, because I don't detect that work going on. But if you're in a world where the superpower has decided that its real preoccupation is China, which is, after all, the real preoccupation. And they're no longer interested in European security in at all the same way. And they're prepared to cut deals with Putin, which would sell Zelensky down the river. If you're in that world, that's an incredibly difficult world for the EU to be in. And it does then raise the question of, are the Brits a serious long-term reliable security partner? And what do we mean by that? And then that gets you into the economics as well as the pure hard security. And that's why I think if we did have Donald Trump by the end of the year, broadly at the same time as we had Keir Starmer, I think there's a very big debate or set of debates to be had. Quite how they're had and with whom and at what speed and in what form, I don't know. But then the question of, okay, we're much more on our own and much more exposed than we thought we were going to be. We're going to have to move really fast on capability. We're going to have to spend vast sums of money. That's why the whole Eurobonds question is coming back. The fascinating thing from the outside is, as I say, a lot of the people who've been extremely negative in the past about Eurobonds, you know, have been in Northern Europe and the Northern European states who've been completely anti that. Well, they're not so anti it now. Very uncomfortable for Germany, incidentally, this, because Germany remains deeply uncomfortable with the idea of Eurobonds for these purposes, but may find that its Finnish and Baltic allies have sort of rather deserted that.
Well, I'd be very interested to see if there's any questions on this, because as people recall, we immediately at the pandemic jumped, we were sort of considered the frugals, and we immediately jumped into the bond, the southern camp, going for a bond issuance. It'll be very interesting to see if the Eurobond thing comes back on the table for defence, given our nuclear
and then
status,
the French see an opportunity there of, okay, so you can progress the entire fiscal framework and the purpose of the broader purpose of the European budget and make this a permanent thing. And now we've got support from what used to be rather sort of Parisian skeptical hardliners, but because it's now about, you know, the Russian issue, those people are on board for something radically different.
And something I have to come to, I know I want to come to questions soon and a few other things, but Joschka Fischer has recently mentioned the issue of nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Now, Ireland has a long tradition in its foreign policy of campaigning against non-proliferation. We're now in a completely different world where the Germans are now talking about potentially looking at nuclear weapons. How, you know, any thoughts on that? Just not specifically related to Ireland, but just that question of nuclear proliferation within Europe. Does that just reflect how seriously the security situation has changed?
I'm afraid it does, you know. And I think Germany's orthodoxy, it's easy to be sort of unkind about German policy, above all on energy. I think we were at the time, so I hope it doesn't sound wise after the event. But, you know, in fairness to David Cameron, post-Crimea, even pre-Crimea, extremely concerned about a German policy on pipelines, the degree of dependency on Russian hydrocarbons, whatever. You know, I think we were saying all of this pretty systematically for many years to Frau Merkel and others, and we weren't getting an audience. And there's always been a German history with Russia is, after all, very different from us, and they also have a much deeper trade and investment relationship and very good reasons for it. So I don't want that to come out the wrong way, but nevertheless, there was a sort of Wandel durch Handel approach of a kind of, you know, we change the Russian system and we bring the Russians in some way into a wider European family by the trading relationship, including the energy relationship. That has blown up just as much as the kind of values-free version of globalization under Brexit. So the German economic model doesn't really work anymore because it was dependent on massive dependence on Russian, relatively cheap Russian hydrocarbons, and massive dependence on huge export market into China. You can see why Scholz was in China. Germany's trade and investment relationship with China and also its manufacturing capability of German firms inside China is vastly greater than Britain's, vastly greater than Britain. I mean, the trading relationship is at least 5 times, I think, Britain's size. So this is a huge problem for the whole German model, which is based on sort of Mittelstand strengths, it's based on export, but it's based on a sort of mercantilism, which is very politically naive in the world that we now inhabit. So this is forcing a big change in German foreign policy and German defense policy. It's obviously extremely difficult for Scholz to handle within his own party because the left of his own party clearly don't like it. And he's, you know, got huge problems inside his coalition. But German orthodoxy about how the world works has changed more in the last 4 years than in the previous 40, because the world doesn't appear to work in the way that German policy for the last 30 years is predicated on.
Moving to the related trade issues and a Trump 2 presidency, he said he's going to put a 10% tariff on everything that comes into the US.
Yeah.
Does the UK, and let me say, I think in my view, Ireland is we're more integrated into the US.
Yes,
into the US than we were with
yeah.
Britain. So the potential economic impact is actually greater for us because there'll be retaliatory measures by the EU,
yeah.
and the disruption is potentially greater than Brexit economically for us. But my question is, what do you think the UK under a Starmer government would do? Would it seek to move closer into the US orbit and seek to be excluded from those tariffs? Or would it take a retaliatory approach and standard sort of diplomatic trade diplomacy and hit US goods coming into the UK with tariffs?
Fascinating question. Impossible to answer. Really very, very difficult to gauge where they'd be. I think any British Prime Minister will want a strong and deep and no doubt characterised a special relationship with the US president, even a Trump 2 presidency. But let's face it, it would be pretty difficult for an incoming Labour Prime Minister. And I'm sure there will be some preoccupations inside the Labour Party about what Trump would do, how he would behave, who else he would be talking to in the British system, and whether there was a risk that actually it was the opposition, both inside Parliament and outside Parliament, to Starmer that he was primarily interested in talking to. So there'll always be a reflex in the UK system to say, but we're different, we're special, and we're outside the EU, and therefore you can't possibly do this to us, and we have a different relationship, and we're a P5 player, and we're an intelligence player. Everybody, incidentally, we won't be, Trump will also divide a lot within the EU. It's not just Viktor Orban. Right. There'll be plenty of people meddling in a kind of, well, maybe, Trump is better for, there'll be the Melonis and Le Pens or whatever. We've got very difficult issues coming up in France in the next couple of years. There'll be plenty of others thinking, can we play both ends against the middle? Can we differentiate ourselves from other European players? The risk for Europe or the European Union is a very fragmented approach to dealing with Trump 2 and not much agreement at leader level as to how to deal with it. My instinct, obviously, if Ursula von der Leyen is back as Commission President, it's been interesting watching the way she has played the American relationship. And it's fascinating to a Brit, certainly, to find, and I think it causes a certain amount of disquiet in the UK or in some parts of the UK, that the current US administration, if it wants to answer the Kissinger question of who do you ring if you want to talk to Europe, it's probably Ursula von der Leyen at the moment, which nobody in Britain would have thought 20 years ago that the Commission President would be the person the American president would ring up. She has deliberately made a beeline to be very close to the Biden administration. She has also then, and for good geostrategic reasons, no doubt, as well as her kind of personal instinct, she's also, I think it would be fair to say, sort of toughened up the position vis-a-vis China on investment screening and anti-dumping and, increasingly vigorous measures about Chinese economic behavior and Chinese trading behavior. And it seems to me she's gone further on that certainly than the German administration would want to, or sounds as though it's up for, and probably than others. Now, again, I presume she's partly doing that thinking, well, under any putative US administration, how much difference is there really going to be, has there been between a Biden administration and a Trump administration on the China question? And the reality is the Americans will, on things like electric vehicles, essentially close their market to Chinese production. What's the consequence of that? It's all coming here and the UK. One reason why the EU and the UK should be talking in depth about the Chinese question as well.
So that's the final question. So people, we're not going to have that much time. I'm going to come to questions straight after, but I just want to get into the China issue and what do you think the direction of travel for Europe is? Are we going to effectively say we are in the American Western bloc? are we going to try and stay somewhat float between the two and be a separate bloc? Where do you see the direction of travel for Europe vis-a-vis China?
Well, as I say, in Brussels, you can see a hardening up of position, much more militant position. That seems to me to be driven by the top floor of Berlaymont. It's coming from von der Leyen herself, but a hardening up on investment screening both ways, on trade measures, on anti-dumping measures, on anti-subsidy measures and whatever. What is this a response to? It's a response to Chinese asymmetrical decoupling, because Chinese strategy is, as far as I can see, perceived in Brussels to be about reducing dependency and sometimes market access for European firms in China, but creating more dependency in Europe on, specific goods which do have a security implication. So I think Brussels has moved harder line, led by the President of the Commission. I don't think that will be universally the case in the Council and at leader level. And I think this is a very big set of debate. But on the politics of this, the raw politics of this, when Chinese electric vehicles hit UK and EU streets, and they are capable of outcompeting at mass models anything that EU companies can produce, and therefore take a sizable market share, what happens then? Because as I say, the Americans will just bluntly close their market, and I think that'll happen under Biden, let alone Trump. And the Americans will take aggressive tariff action, as far as you can ever predict what Trump would do. But if he takes kind of Bob Lighthizer kind of advice, that's where they'll go. You never know exactly with Trump whether he would then, go and see Xi and boast that he'd achieved the best deal of the century or something. But you can never be totally sure. But I think they'll go further in that direction. And obviously for Europe, then the question of, do we ease more in an American direction under American pressure precisely in order to buy a better relationship with the Americans on our own security needs, on our own eastern frontier? This dynamic is going to be extraordinarily difficult.
I'd like to thank Sir Ivan Rogers for joining us and sharing his insights on such a wide range of issues. And always a pleasure to have you. Thank you.